The briefcase shouldn't have been left open on the kitchen counter. That was my first thought when I walked into our supposedly happy home at 6:30 on a Tuesday evening, expecting to find dinner warming in the oven and my wife Jenna preparing for another evening of helping troubled couples find their way back to each other. Instead, I found silence, scattered papers, and a phone I'd never seen before. My name is David Mitchell, and I fix things for a living. Broken pipes, faulty electrical systems, busted heating units at Jefferson Elementary School where I work as head maintenance supervisor. 20 years of troubleshooting has taught me that when something looks wrong, it usually is wrong. The phone sitting next to Jenna's therapy session notes looked very, very wrong. It was small, cheap, the kind you buy with cash at a gas station, the kind people use when they don't want their regular phone showing certain calls or messages. The screen lit up when I touched it, revealing a text conversation that made my stomach drop through the floor. Can't wait to see you Thursday. Same time, same place. R. The response, sent from this phone. I've been thinking about you all week. Our sessions are becoming very therapeutic. I stood there holding this piece of plastic that was apparently demolishing my 15-year marriage, reading message after message that got progressively more explicit. My wife, Dr. Jenna Ardell, licensed marriage and family therapist, was having detailed conversations about body parts and bedroom activities with someone identified only as R in the contacts. But it got worse. Much worse. There were photos. Pictures that definitely weren't taken in her professional office downtown. Pictures that showed my wife in poses that would make her professional ethics board very interested in having a long conversation with her. I scrolled through the message history, my maintenance supervisor brain automatically cataloging dates and times. Thursday appointments, late evening, emergency sessions, weekend client crises that required her immediate attention. Every single one corresponded with a time Jenna had told me she was working late, helping some poor couple save their marriage. The irony wasn't lost on me. While I was home eating microwave dinners and watching television alone, my marriage counselor wife was providing very personal therapy to at least one of her clients, maybe more than one, judging by the different phone numbers in the message threads. I heard her car in the driveway and quickly put the phone back where I'd found it. The papers went back into a neat stack. By the time Jenna walked through the front door, I was sitting at the kitchen table with a beer, looking like the same trusting husband who'd kissed her goodbye that morning. "Hey, honey," she said, dropping her purse and that damning briefcase on the counter. "Sorry I'm running late. Had a client emergency that ran over." "Which client?" I asked, keeping my voice level. She paused for just a moment, just long enough for me to know she was calculating her answer. "The Hendersons. They're going through a really rough patch right now. Sometimes these crisis sessions are the only thing standing between a couple and complete breakdown." I nodded and took another sip of beer. "That's rough. Good thing they have you to help them work through their problems." "Exactly." She smiled and started pulling containers from the refrigerator. "I know it's hard on you when I have to work late, but this is what I do. I help people save their marriages." The casual way she lied to my face while standing 3 feet from evidence of her betrayal was almost impressive. Almost. After dinner, I excused myself to the basement workshop where I keep my tools and work on weekend projects. But instead of fixing the broken chair I'd been meaning to get to, I sat at my workbench and started making a list. Dates, times, names from the phone contacts. Every detail I could remember from those messages. My maintenance training kicked in again. When you're diagnosing a problem, you document everything. You gather evidence. You figure out exactly what's broken before you decide how to fix it. Or in this case, before you decide whether it can be fixed at all. I spent 3 hours in that basement writing down everything I'd seen. The phone had contained 2 years' worth of messages. 2 years of my wife conducting what appeared to be multiple affairs with her therapy clients while I worked overtime to pay for her continuing education courses and professional development seminars. The next morning, Jenna left for work like nothing had happened. She kissed my cheek, told me she loved me, and reminded me that she had a late appointment with a difficult couple who needed extra attention. I called in a personal day at school and spent the morning learning everything I could about professional ethics for licensed therapists in our state. What I found was fascinating and horrible in equal measure. According to the state licensing board's website, contact between therapists and current clients is considered one of the most serious ethical violations possible. It's grounds for immediate license suspension and potential criminal charges. The board takes these complaints very seriously and investigates every single report. I printed out the relevant statutes and ethics codes. I read case studies of other therapists who'd lost their licenses for similar behavior. I learned about something called dual relationships and exploitation of the therapeutic process. My wife wasn't just cheating on me. She was committing professional misconduct that could end her career and potentially land her in legal trouble. That evening, she came home with flowers and wine, suggesting we have a romantic dinner together. She was especially affectionate, asking about my day, telling me how much she appreciated everything I did to support her career. I wondered if this sudden attention was guilt, or if one of her clients had canceled their appointment. "I've been thinking," she said over dessert. "Maybe we should plan a vacation. Just the two of us. We haven't had quality time together in months." "That sounds nice," I replied. "When were you thinking?" "Maybe next month. I could clear my schedule, refer my ongoing clients to Dr. Martinez for a week or two." I nodded and smiled, but inside I was calculating. A vacation would mean leaving town right when her affairs were heating up. It would mean disrupting whatever schedule she'd established with her client lovers. It was damage control, whether she realized it or not. That night, after she fell asleep, I went back to the basement and continued my research. I learned about something called a complaint process, where anyone can file a report with the state licensing board about therapist misconduct. The complaints are investigated by trained professionals who interview witnesses, review evidence, and make determinations about whether violations occurred. I also learned that the board keeps detailed records of all complaints and investigations. Even if a therapist isn't ultimately disciplined, the complaint becomes part of their permanent file. By 3 a.m, I had a plan. I wasn't going to confront Jenna directly. I wasn't going to demand explanations or beg her to end the affairs. I wasn't going to suggest marriage counseling, which would have been ironic beyond belief. Instead, I was going to let her profession's own ethics system handle the situation. I was going to document everything, file a formal complaint, and let the state board investigate my wife's conduct using their own professional standards. But first, I needed more evidence. The next few days fell into a routine. Jenna would leave for work, I would go to school and fix whatever needed fixing, and in the evenings I would quietly gather information about my wife's secret life. I found her appointment book and cross-referenced the names with the contacts in that burner phone. R was Reed Thompson, a 42-year-old insurance adjuster whose marriage had been in crisis for over a year, according to Jenna's notes. His wife had apparently moved out 6 months ago, right around the time his text messages to my wife became especially graphic. There was also M, Michael Chen, whose couple's therapy sessions had somehow continued even after his wife stopped attending 3 months ago, and T, Thomas Bradley, who'd been seeing Jenna for individual sessions to work on relationship issues twice a week for 8 months. 3 different men. 3 different ongoing affairs disguised as therapy relationships. I started taking photos of everything with my own phone. The appointment book, the burner phone messages, even Jenna's therapy notes that she sometimes brought home to review. Her own meticulous record-keeping was creating a detailed timeline of her professional misconduct. The more I read, the more disgusted I became. Not just with the affairs, but with how she was manipulating these men. Her therapy notes revealed a pattern of identifying vulnerable clients, gradually crossing professional boundaries, and then exploiting their emotional dependence on her. Reed Thompson's file showed how she'd slowly transitioned from discussing his marital problems to encouraging him to explore his needs and embrace his authentic desires. Michael Chen's notes documented how she'd convinced him that his wife wasn't meeting his emotional needs and that he deserved someone who truly understood him. She was using her professional training to seduce vulnerable men who'd come to her for help. She was exploiting their trust and emotional vulnerability for her own gratification, and she was billing their insurance companies for every single session. That's when I realized this wasn't just about adultery or professional ethics violations. This was fraud. She was charging insurance companies for therapy sessions that were actually personal encounters. She was billing for professional services while providing something entirely different. I spent that weekend alone, while Jenna attended a professional development conference in the state capitol. She called twice to check in, telling me about the fascinating workshops she was attending and the networking opportunities with other therapists. I used the time to organize everything I'd gathered into a comprehensive file: photos, dates, appointment records, insurance billing statements I found in her home office. By Sunday evening, I had enough evidence to end her career and potentially send her to prison. But I wanted to be absolutely certain before I made my move. Monday morning, I called the state licensing board and asked about their complaint process. The woman who answered was professional and helpful, explaining that anyone could file a complaint about therapist misconduct and that all complaints were investigated thoroughly. What kind of evidence would be most helpful in an investigation? I asked. Documentation is key, she replied. Appointment records, communications, any evidence of inappropriate contact or boundary violations. The more detailed, the better. I thanked her and hung up, knowing I had exactly what they needed. That evening, Jenna came home excited about a new client she'd be seeing twice a week. A young man whose marriage was in serious trouble and who really needed intensive therapeutic support. I listened to her describe this vulnerable person who would soon become her next victim, and I made my final decision. It was time to let the professional world know exactly what kind of therapy Dr. Jenna Ardell was really providing. Tuesday morning marked the beginning of what I now think of as my own investigation. While Jenna left for her office, chattering about her busy day of helping couples reconnect, I drove to the local electronics store and bought a small digital camera with a good zoom lens. My plan was simple: document everything. Every late-night visit to her office, every unexplained absence, every lie she told about her whereabouts. If I was going to file a complaint with the state board, I wanted evidence that was absolutely bulletproof. The first thing I learned was that my wife had become very sloppy about hiding her activities. Maybe she thought I was too trusting or too stupid to notice. Maybe the thrill of the affairs had made her careless. Whatever the reason, following her routine was easier than tracking a broken pipe through a building's walls. Her office was in a converted Victorian house downtown, painted pale yellow with white trim and a discreet sign reading Ardell Family Therapy Services. She rented the entire second floor with a waiting area, 2 therapy rooms, and a private office where she kept client files and conducted intake sessions. I parked across the street behind a delivery truck and watched through the camera's viewfinder as she arrived at 8:30, unlocked the front door, and turned on the lights. Her first legitimate appointment wasn't until 10 o'clock, according to the schedule she'd left on our kitchen counter. At 9:15, Reed Thompson's silver Honda pulled into the small parking lot behind the building. I took photos of his license plate, the timestamp on the camera showing exactly when he arrived. Through the second-floor windows, I could see shadows moving around, but the blinds were closed too tightly to make out details. Reed left at 9:50, just 10 minutes before Jenna's actual first client arrived. Perfect timing to avoid any awkward encounters in the parking lot. I followed this routine for 3 days, learning that my wife had developed a very organized system for her extracurricular activities. Early morning sessions with Reed on Tuesdays and Thursdays, late evening appointments with Michael Chen on Mondays and Wednesdays, after her legitimate clients had gone home. Weekend emergency sessions with Thomas Bradley that lasted 2 or 3 hours and always happened when his wife was at her mother's house. Each affair had its own schedule, its own pattern, its own carefully maintained boundaries to prevent the men from discovering each other. On Thursday evening, I decided to get closer. Jenna had told me she'd be working late with a couple in crisis who needed an emergency session. I knew from her pattern that this meant Michael Chen would be arriving at her office around 7 o'clock for what her appointment book listed as individual therapy, relationship trauma. I parked in the alley behind the building and used the fire escape to climb up near the second-floor windows. The building was old, and the windows didn't fit properly in their frames. I could hear voices clearly through the gaps. What I heard wasn't therapy. "I can't stop thinking about you," Michael's voice was saying. "This whole situation with my wife, the divorce proceedings, everything. You're the only good thing in my life right now." "That's what I'm here for," Jenna replied. "To help you work through these feelings and figure out what you really need." "What I need is you," he said. "I know this is complicated, because you're my therapist, but what we have feels so real." "Professional boundaries exist for good reasons," she said, but her tone was playful, not professional. "But sometimes those boundaries can be flexible when there's genuine connection." I listened to my wife manipulate this vulnerable man's emotions while billing his insurance company $60 for a therapy session. She was using textbook therapeutic language to justify an affair with a client who was obviously emotionally dependent on her. The conversation continued for another hour, moving from pseudo-therapeutic discussion to increasingly personal topics. By the time Michael left, I had recorded enough audio on my phone to demonstrate exactly how Jenna was exploiting the therapeutic relationship. Friday morning, I made copies of everything I'd gathered and stored them in a safety deposit box at our bank. Photos, audio recordings, copies of her appointment books and billing records, screenshots of the burner phone messages. If anything happened to the originals, I'd still have evidence. That weekend, Jenna suggested we drive to the coast for a spontaneous romantic getaway. She was especially attentive, holding my hand while we walked on the beach, talking about how much she loved me and appreciated our marriage. I played along, but I kept thinking about Michael Chen's voice, saying he couldn't stop thinking about her, about Reed Thompson's text messages describing what he wanted to do to her, about Thomas Bradley's weekend emergency sessions that lasted longer than most movies. "You seem distracted," Jenna said as we sat at a waterfront restaurant Saturday evening. "Is everything okay at work?" "Just thinking about a problem I need to solve," I replied. "Something that's been broken for a while, and I'm trying to figure out the best way to fix it." She squeezed my hand across the table. "You're so good at fixing things. I'm sure you'll figure it out." The irony was overwhelming. My wife, who spent her days counseling other people about relationship problems, had no idea that her own marriage was about to be dismantled by her own professional ethics board. Sunday evening, we drove home with Jenna chattering about how nice it had been to get away together and how we should do it more often. She seemed relaxed and happy, probably because she'd managed to go 48 hours without lying to me about her whereabouts. Monday morning, I called in sick to work and spent the day at the public library, using their computers to research everything I could find about therapist licensing violations and the complaint process. What I learned was encouraging. The state board took misconduct complaints very seriously, especially when they involved current clients. They had investigators trained specifically to handle these cases, and they had the authority to subpoena records, interview witnesses, and suspend licenses immediately if they found evidence of violations. I also learned that insurance fraud related to therapy billing was handled jointly by the licensing board and the state insurance commissioner's office. If they determined that Jenna was billing for services she wasn't actually providing, she could face criminal charges in addition to losing her license. Tuesday morning, I was ready to begin the formal process. I started by calling the state licensing board and requesting complaint forms. The woman who answered transferred me to an investigator named Patricia Williams, who explained the process in detail. "We take all complaints seriously," she said, "but the more documentation you can provide, the stronger the investigation will be. Do you have specific dates, times, and evidence of inappropriate contact?" "Yes," I said. "Extensive documentation." "Good. I'll email you the forms today. Once you submit them with your evidence, we'll begin a formal investigation within 30 days. The therapist will be notified that a complaint has been filed and will interview all relevant parties." I spent the rest of the week preparing my complaint. 23 pages of detailed allegations supported by photos, audio recordings, appointment records, and billing statements. I documented every affair, every fraudulent insurance claim, every violation of professional ethics I'd discovered. The hardest part was writing about my own marriage in clinical, legal language, describing how my wife had betrayed our relationship while exploiting vulnerable clients, required me to set aside my emotions and focus on facts, but I managed it. By Friday afternoon, I had a complaint package that would end Jenna's career and potentially send her to prison. I just needed to decide when to submit it. That evening, Jenna came home with Chinese takeout and a bottle of wine, suggesting we have a cozy night in together. She was affectionate and talkative, telling me about her day and asking about mine. "I love our life together," she said as we sat on the couch after dinner. "Sometimes I think about how lucky I am to have a husband who supports my career and understands how important my work is." I nodded and refilled her wine glass, thinking about the complaint forms sitting in my desk drawer upstairs. "Your work is definitely important," I agreed. "I'm sure your clients really depend on you." "They do," she said, curling up against my shoulder. "Some of them are going through such difficult times. Divorces, separations, relationship trauma. They need someone they can trust completely." The casual way she described exploiting people's trust, while literally leaning against the husband she was betraying, was almost surreal. "Trust is important in any relationship," I said. "Absolutely. Without trust, relationships just fall apart." I kissed the top of her head and told her I loved her, knowing it would probably be the last time I'd say those words and mean them. Saturday morning, while Jenna was at her yoga class, I drove to the state office building downtown and submitted my complaint in person. Patricia Williams reviewed the package quickly, her eyebrows rising as she flipped through the documentation. "This is very thorough," she said. "We'll begin our investigation immediately. Dr. Ardell will be notified by certified mail within 5 business days that a complaint has been filed." "How long does the investigation usually take?" I asked. "It depends on the complexity of the case and how cooperative the parties are. Based on what you've provided here, I'd estimate 6 to 8 weeks for a preliminary determination." I thanked her and left, knowing that I'd just set in motion a process that would destroy everything Jenna had worked for over the past 15 years. But I wasn't done yet. That afternoon, I sat down at my computer and began writing a Google review for Ardell Family Therapy Services. Writing that Google review took me 3 hours and 17 drafts. It had to be perfect, detailed enough to be damning, but careful enough to avoid libel. Clinical enough to sound credible, but accessible enough for ordinary people to understand what they were reading. I started with the facts. Dr. Jenna Ardell, licensed marriage and family therapist, had been engaging in relationships with multiple current clients while billing their insurance companies for legitimate therapy services. This represented violations of professional ethics, insurance fraud, and exploitation of vulnerable individuals seeking help for relationship problems. I documented the pattern without naming specific victims. References to ongoing inappropriate contact with at least 3 current male clients and systematic exploitation of the therapeutic relationship for personal gratification. I cited specific ethics codes she'd violated and explained how she'd used her professional training to manipulate emotionally vulnerable men. The most damaging paragraph described her billing practices. how she'd charged insurance companies for couples therapy sessions after the wives had stopped attending, how she'd billed for individual therapy sessions that were actually personal encounters, how she'd used professional appointment scheduling to coordinate multiple affairs. I included dates and times without being specific enough to identify individuals. References to Tuesday morning appointments with Client A and Thursday evening sessions with Client B that corresponded with insurance billing records. The final paragraph was personal but professional. I identified myself as her husband and explained that I discovered her activities through careful documentation over several weeks. I noted that I'd filed a formal complaint with the state licensing board and provided evidence to support a full investigation. Potential clients should be aware, I concluded, that Dr. Ardell has used her practice to exploit vulnerable individuals seeking legitimate therapeutic help. Her conduct represents a serious violation of professional ethics and personal trust. I gave her practice 1 star out of 5. At 11:47 on Sunday night, I posted the review and went to bed. Monday morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls on my phone. Jenna was in the kitchen, pacing back and forth while talking rapidly into her cell phone. Her laptop was open on the counter, showing her practice's Google page with my review prominently displayed at the top. "I don't know who would do this," she was saying. "It's completely false, obviously written by someone with a personal grudge. Can we get Google to remove it?" She saw me walk into the kitchen and ended her call quickly. "David, someone posted a horrible review of my practice online, completely made-up accusations about professional misconduct. It's obviously someone trying to damage my reputation." I poured myself coffee and sat down at the counter, glancing at her laptop screen. My review had already received 43 views and 3 comments from people expressing shock and concern. "That's terrible," I said. "What kind of accusations?" "Just professional stuff. Ethics violations, billing issues, complete nonsense, but it makes me look terrible. I'm trying to figure out how to get it removed." Her phone rang again. She glanced at the caller ID and frowned. "It's Dr. Martinez," she said. "I need to take this." I listened to her side of the conversation while pretending to read the newspaper. Dr. Martinez had apparently seen the review and was calling to ask if everything was okay. Other therapists in their professional network were starting to ask questions. "It's just someone with a personal vendetta," Jenna kept repeating. "Probably a disgruntled client or something. You know how it is. You can't help everyone, and sometimes people lash out." After she hung up, her phone immediately rang again. Then again. By 9 o'clock, she'd received calls from 6 different colleagues, 2 former clients, and someone from her malpractice insurance company. "I need to go to the office and do damage control," she said, grabbing her briefcase and keys. "This is a nightmare. One fake review could destroy everything I've worked for." After she left, I checked her practice's Google page again. The review now had over 200 views and 15 comments. People were sharing it on Facebook and local community forums. Someone had screenshot it and posted it to a therapist discussion group with the caption, "Has anyone heard about this situation?" My phone rang at 10:30. Patricia Williams from the licensing board. "Mr. Mitchell, I wanted to let you know that Dr. Ardell's case has been expedited due to some additional information we received this morning. We'll be conducting interviews with potential witnesses starting this week." "What additional information?" I asked. "Your Google review was forwarded to us by several people, including other therapists and former clients. It's generated quite a bit of attention in the professional community. We've received 3 additional complaints about Dr. Ardell since yesterday." I felt a surge of satisfaction mixed with vindication. Other people had suspected something was wrong with Jenna's practice, but my review had given them the framework to understand what they'd observed. "How does this affect the investigation timeline?" I asked. "We'll have a preliminary determination within 2 weeks instead of 6 to 8. The additional complaints provide corroborating evidence that supports your allegations." Tuesday morning brought more phone calls and more panic from Jenna. Her practice's Google page now showed 4 one-star reviews, all referencing my original post and adding their own observations about inappropriate behavior they'd witnessed or suspected. One review, posted by someone named Jennifer K., described bringing her husband to couples therapy and noticing how Dr. Ardell focused all her attention on him while dismissing Jennifer's concerns. She kept scheduling individual sessions with my husband and telling me he needed space to process. Now I understand what was really happening. Another review, from Mark D., described his wife's sudden change in behavior after starting individual therapy with Dr. Ardell. She became secretive about her sessions and started staying late for extended appointments. When I suggested we try couples therapy, Dr. Ardell said I wasn't emotionally ready to participate. The pattern was becoming clear to anyone who read the reviews. Jenna had been systematically targeting vulnerable clients for years, not just the 3 men I'd identified. Wednesday morning, Jenna received a certified letter from the state licensing board informing her that a formal complaint had been filed and that she was required to respond within 10 days. She also received a letter from her malpractice insurance company requesting copies of all client files and billing records for the past 2 years. "They can't do this," she said, waving the letters at me. "This is harassment based on false accusations. I'm going to hire a lawyer and fight this." "Maybe you should talk to someone," I suggested. "Get professional advice about how to handle the situation." "I am a professional," she snapped. "I know exactly what this is. Someone is trying to destroy my career with lies, and I won't let them succeed." Thursday brought more reviews, more phone calls, and more panic. Jenna's practice now had 12 one-star reviews, and her overall rating had dropped to 1.2 stars. Several clients had canceled their appointments, and 2 referral sources had called to express concerns about the allegations. Friday afternoon, Patricia Williams called again. "Mr. Mitchell, we've completed our preliminary review of the evidence you provided, and we'll be conducting formal interviews next week. We've also received additional documentation from other sources that corroborates your allegations." "What kind of documentation?" I asked. "Insurance records, appointment schedules, and witness statements from former clients. It appears Dr. Ardell's inappropriate conduct was more extensive than even your complaint indicated." That evening, Jenna came home looking defeated. She'd spent the day meeting with a lawyer who'd explained that the licensing board investigation was serious and that she could face both professional discipline and criminal charges if the allegations were substantiated. "I might need to take a temporary leave of absence," she said quietly, "just until this gets sorted out. The lawyer thinks it would look better if I'm proactive about addressing the situation." I nodded sympathetically while thinking about how her temporary leave was about to become permanent. Saturday morning, I woke up to find Jenna sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop, staring at her practice's Google page. Overnight, 3 more reviews had been posted, bringing her total to 15 one-star ratings and an overall score of 1.1 stars. "It's over," she said without looking up. 15 years of building my practice, and it's completely destroyed by lies." "Maybe it's not too late to fix things," I suggested. "If you're honest with the licensing board about what really happened, they might be more lenient." She looked at me sharply. "What really happened is that someone is trying to destroy my career with false accusations. There's nothing to be honest about because I haven't done anything wrong." Even facing complete professional ruin, she was still lying, still maintaining the fiction that she was the victim of some elaborate conspiracy rather than the architect of her own destruction. Sunday evening, she received a call from Dr. Martinez, informing her that their professional referral relationship was being suspended pending the outcome of the licensing board investigation. 2 other colleagues called with similar messages. "Everyone's abandoning me," she said after the last call. "People I've worked with for years are just assuming the worst based on anonymous internet reviews." "Maybe they know something you don't," I suggested. She stared at me for a long moment, and for the first time since this started, I saw a flicker of suspicion in her eyes. What do you mean by that? Just that colleagues usually don't react this strongly unless they have reasons to be concerned. Maybe there were warning signs that people noticed, but didn't say anything about until now. The suspicion in her eyes deepened, but she didn't pursue it. Instead, she went upstairs to make more phone calls to lawyers and professional consultants, trying to find someone who could help her salvage her career. Monday morning, Patricia Williams called with an update that would change everything. Mr. Mitchell, we've scheduled formal interviews with the 3 clients you identified in your complaint. All 3 have agreed to cooperate with the investigation and provide testimony about their relationships with Dr. Ardell. They're willing to admit what happened? I asked. More than willing. It appears they've been feeling exploited and manipulated, but didn't know how to address the situation until your complaint provided a framework for understanding what they experienced. The investigation was about to move from documentation to testimony. Jenna's victims were ready to tell their stories. The first interview was scheduled for Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock. Reed Thompson, the insurance adjuster who'd been having therapeutic sessions with my wife for over a year, was finally going to tell someone in authority what those sessions actually involved. I knew this because Patricia Williams had called Monday evening to inform me that I could observe the interviews if I wanted to. As the complainant, I had the right to be present when witnesses gave their statements to the licensing board investigators. It might be difficult to hear, she warned. These men are going to describe their relationships with your wife in considerable detail. I need to hear it, I said. I need to know exactly what she did to these people. Tuesday morning, I sat in a conference room at the state office building, watching Reed Thompson fidget with a coffee cup while 2 investigators prepared their recording equipment. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 35, with the soft appearance of someone who spent his days behind a desk processing insurance claims. Mr. Thompson, Patricia Williams began, you understand that this interview is being recorded and that your statements may be used in disciplinary proceedings against Dr. Jenna Ardell? Yes, he said quietly. I understand. Can you describe the nature of your therapeutic relationship with Dr. Ardell? Reed took a deep breath and began talking. What came out was a detailed account of systematic manipulation and exploitation that made me want to punch something. He'd started seeing Jenna for couples therapy after his wife discovered he'd been having an emotional affair with a coworker. The marriage was in crisis, and they'd been referred to Jenna by their family doctor, who praised her expertise with relationship trauma. At first, the sessions seemed normal, Reed said. Dr. Ardell would see us together, talk about communication patterns, give us exercises to work on at home. But after a few weeks, she started suggesting individual sessions for me. What was the reason for individual sessions? The investigator asked. She said I had underlying issues with intimacy and emotional expression that were sabotaging the couple's work. She said my wife couldn't be present because I needed a safe space to explore my authentic feelings without judgment. The individual sessions had started innocently enough. Jenna would ask about his childhood, his relationship with his parents, his fears about commitment and intimacy. Standard therapeutic territory, according to Reed. But gradually, the focus shifted to my physical needs and desires. She would ask very detailed questions about my relationship with my wife, our physical intimacy, what I found satisfying or frustrating. Did this seem appropriate to you at the time? Patricia Williams asked. I didn't know. I'd never been in therapy before. Dr. Ardell kept saying that addressing physical intimacy was crucial for relationship healing, and that many therapists avoided these topics because they were uncomfortable discussing them. Reed described how Jenna had gradually convinced him that his wife was emotionally unavailable and unable to meet his needs. She'd encouraged him to think about what he really wanted in a relationship and to stop settling for less than he deserved. She started touching me during sessions, he continued. Just brief contact at first, a hand on my shoulder, touching my arm when she was making a point. She said physical comfort was an important part of the therapeutic process. I watched Reed's face as he described how my wife had systematically broken down his boundaries and exploited his vulnerability. He looked ashamed and angry in equal measure. "When did the relationship become?" the investigator asked. "About 4 months into the individual sessions. My wife had moved out by then, and I was feeling completely lost. Dr. Ardell said I was making breakthrough progress and that I needed intensive support to continue healing." Reed described how Jenna had scheduled longer appointments, sometimes 2 or 3 hours, always at times when no other clients would be in the building. She'd convinced him that their connection was part of his therapeutic breakthrough and that physical intimacy was helping him learn to trust again. She kept saying it was unconventional, but that conventional therapy wasn't working for someone with my complex trauma patterns. She made it sound like she was doing something special for me, something that required courage and professional risk on her part. "Did you pay for these sessions?" Patricia Williams asked. "Yes. She billed my insurance company for individual therapy at the regular rate, $60 per session, sometimes $90 for the longer appointments." "Did you understand that you were paying for therapy services?" Reed looked uncomfortable. Yes, but she said the billing was just a framework, and that what we were doing was therapeutic intimacy rather than traditional therapy. She said insurance companies wouldn't understand, but that didn't make it less legitimate. The interview continued for 2 hours. Reed described how Jenna had isolated him from friends and family, convinced him that no one else understood his healing process, and made him believe that their relationship was essential for his emotional recovery. "When did you realize that something was wrong?" the investigator asked. "When I read the Google review," Reed said quietly. "Seeing it described in clinical terms, seeing the pattern laid out clearly, I realized I'd been manipulated. She'd used my emotional vulnerability and my trust in her professional expertise to exploit me." "How do you feel about the relationship now?" "Violated, angry, confused. I went to her for help saving my marriage, and she destroyed it while convincing me it was therapy. My wife and I might have been able to work things out if we'd had legitimate counseling instead of whatever this was." After Reed left, I sat in the conference room feeling nauseated. Hearing the details of how Jenna had systematically destroyed this man's marriage while billing his insurance company for the privilege was worse than I'd imagined. "Are you okay?" Patricia Williams asked. "I need some air," I said. I spent my lunch break walking around downtown, trying to process what I'd heard. Reed Thompson wasn't just someone my wife had an affair with. He was a victim of professional exploitation who'd been manipulated into believing his exploitation was healing. Wednesday morning brought Michael Chen's interview. He was older than Reed, maybe 45, with the tired appearance of someone who'd been through a difficult divorce. His story followed a similar pattern: couples therapy that transitioned to individual sessions after his wife stopped attending. Gradual boundary violations justified as therapeutic interventions. Contact presented as healing work that required courage and trust. But Michael's interview revealed something new. Jenna had been actively sabotaging his attempts to reconcile with his wife. "She would give me advice about how to communicate with my wife," he explained. But looking back, I realized the advice was designed to make things worse. She'd tell me to express my authentic needs in ways that my wife found threatening or demanding. "Can you give us a specific example?" the investigator asked. "My wife was upset that I was spending so much time in therapy and not enough time working on our relationship at home. Dr. Ardell told me to explain that my healing process required intensive support and that my wife was being emotionally controlling by questioning my therapeutic needs." Michael described how Jenna had coached him to use therapeutic language to justify neglecting his marriage while becoming more dependent on their sessions. She'd convinced him that his wife's concerns were signs of her own emotional dysfunction, and that he needed to protect his healing space from her interference. She was systematically destroying my marriage while making me believe she was helping me save it, Michael said. Every piece of advice she gave me drove my wife further away, which made me more dependent on Dr. Ardell for emotional support. The most damaging revelation came when the investigator asked about billing practices. Dr. Ardell told me that my insurance company would only cover individual therapy, not couples work, so she had to bill everything as individual sessions even when we were working on relationship issues. She said it was a necessary accommodation to ensure I could get the help I needed. But your wife had stopped attending sessions months earlier, the investigator pointed out. Yes, but Dr. Ardell said we were still doing couples work because I was learning to hold space for my wife's emotional needs even when she wasn't present. She made it sound like advanced therapeutic technique. Michael's interview lasted 3 hours and included details about how Jenna had convinced him to lie to his wife about the nature of their sessions. She'd coached him to describe their meetings as individual therapy for relationship issues rather than admitting that they'd become personal and physical. I feel like an idiot, Michael said at the end of his interview. I trusted her professional expertise and let her convince me that exploitation was healing. My marriage ended, my wife won't speak to me, and I paid insurance money for the privilege of being manipulated. Thursday morning brought Thomas Bradley's interview, and his story was the most disturbing yet. Thomas had never been married. He'd started seeing Jenna for help with relationship anxiety and difficulty maintaining long-term partnerships. He was shy, socially awkward, and had very limited experience with women. Jenna had identified him as particularly vulnerable and had structured his therapy accordingly. She said my problems with relationships were rooted in experiential deficits, Thomas explained. She said I needed to learn about intimacy and physical connection in a safe, controlled environment before I could have healthy relationships with other women. Did this seem like legitimate therapy to you? Patricia Williams asked. I didn't know what therapy was supposed to be like. Dr. Ardell was the expert, and she explained everything in professional terms. She said, experiential therapy was more effective than traditional talk therapy for someone with my issues. Thomas described how Jenna had convinced him that contact with her was actually therapeutic intervention designed to help him overcome his anxiety and inexperience. She'd presented herself as a professional, providing specialized treatment, rather than a woman exploiting his vulnerability. She said what we were doing was called surrogate therapy, and that it was a legitimate but specialized form of treatment. She gave me articles to read about it and explained how it worked. Did you research surrogate therapy independently? The investigator asked. No. I trusted her expertise. She was the licensed professional, and I was just someone who needed help. Thomas had been seeing Jenna for surrogate therapy twice a week for 8 months, paying full therapy rates for sessions that were entirely in nature. She'd convinced him that this was helping him develop the confidence and experience he needed for real relationships. When did you realize something was wrong? When I read the Google review and realized there were other men having similar therapeutic relationships with Dr. Ardell. Surrogate therapy isn't supposed to involve the actual therapist. There are separate, trained surrogates who work with therapists, but aren't the therapists themselves. Thomas's interview revealed that Jenna had been billing his insurance company for individual therapy for social anxiety and relationship issues, while providing what amounted to prostitution disguised as professional treatment. How do you feel about the experience now? The investigator asked. Violated, exploited, angry. She took advantage of my inexperience and social anxiety to manipulate me into a relationship while convincing me it was medical treatment. I trusted her completely, and she used that trust to exploit me. After Thomas left, Patricia Williams turned to me with a grim expression. Mr. Mitchell, based on these interviews and the evidence you provided, we'll be recommending immediate license suspension pending a full disciplinary hearing. Dr. Ardell's conduct represents serious violations of professional ethics, insurance fraud, and exploitation of vulnerable clients. What happens next? I asked. She'll be notified of the suspension within 48 hours. She'll have the right to request a hearing, but based on the evidence we've gathered, I don't see how she can contest these findings. I drove home that afternoon, knowing that my wife's career was about to end officially. The 3 men she'd exploited had told their stories, and their testimony had confirmed every allegation in my complaint. But I wasn't done yet. There was still one more step in my plan, and it was going to be the most satisfying part of this entire process. Friday afternoon, I was going to be present when Jenna received the news that her license had been suspended. Friday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth and clear skies, the kind of perfect weather that makes everything seem possible. I woke up early, made coffee, and sat on the back porch watching the sunrise while waiting for the phone call that would change everything. Jenna had left for her office at 8:30, still maintaining the pretense that she had a functioning therapy practice. Her appointment book was nearly empty now. Most of her clients had canceled after reading the Google reviews, but she was still going through the motions of professional routine. At 9:15, Patricia Williams called. "Mr. Mitchell, the suspension order has been signed and will be delivered to Dr. Ardell's office this morning. A licensing board representative will be present to ensure she understands the terms of the suspension and to secure any client files that need to be transferred to other providers." "Can I be there?" I asked. "As the complainant, you have the right to observe the delivery of disciplinary actions, but I should warn you, this might be difficult to watch." "I need to see it," I said. "I need to see her face when she realizes it's over." At 10:30, I parked across the street from Jenna's office and watched as 2 official-looking cars pulled into the small parking lot. Patricia Williams got out of the first car, carrying a briefcase and a large manila envelope. A second investigator emerged from the other vehicle, along with someone I didn't recognize who was probably there to handle the client files. I followed them into the building and up the stairs to Jenna's office. The waiting area was empty. Her 10 o'clock appointment had probably canceled like most of the others. Jenna's door was open, and I could see her sitting at her desk, typing on her laptop. She looked up when she heard footsteps and saw the 3 official visitors approaching her office. "Dr. Ardell?" Patricia Williams said. "I'm Patricia Williams from the State Licensing Board. We spoke on the phone earlier this week. I need to speak with you about the complaint that was filed regarding your practice." Jenna's face went pale, but she maintained her professional composure. "Of course. Please come in and have a seat." I positioned myself in the doorway where I could observe but remain unobtrusive. Jenna glanced at me with confusion. She obviously wasn't expecting her husband to be present for whatever this meeting was about. "Dr. Ardell," Patricia Williams began, "following our investigation into the complaint filed by your husband, David Mitchell, the licensing board has determined that there is sufficient evidence to support allegations of serious professional misconduct." Jenna's composure cracked slightly. "I'm sorry, what complaint? David? What is she talking about?" Patricia Williams opened her briefcase and removed a thick folder. "The complaint alleges that you engaged in relationships with multiple current clients, committed insurance fraud by billing for services you didn't provide, and systematically exploited vulnerable individuals seeking legitimate therapeutic help." "That's completely false," Jenna said quickly. "I don't know what David has told you, but we've conducted extensive interviews with 3 of your former clients," Patricia Williams interrupted. "Reed Thompson, Michael Chen, and Thomas Bradley have all provided detailed testimony about their inappropriate relationships with you. Their statements corroborate the evidence provided in the original complaint." I watched my wife's face as the reality of the situation began to sink in. The color drained from her cheeks, and her hands started trembling slightly. "This is a misunderstanding," she said weakly. "Those men they're confused about the nature of our therapeutic relationship. Sometimes clients develop feelings for their therapists and misinterpret professional boundaries." "Dr. Ardell," the second investigator said, "we have photographs, text messages, audio recordings, and billing records that document systematic violations of professional ethics over a period of more than 2 years. This isn't a matter of client confusion. Jenna looked at me with a mixture of shock and betrayal. David, you've been spying on me? You recorded my sessions? I documented your criminal activity, I replied calmly. Everything I provided to the licensing board was obtained legally and demonstrates a pattern of exploitation and fraud. Patricia Williams removed the manila envelope and placed it on Jenna's desk. Dr. Ardell, your license to practice therapy in this state is hereby suspended immediately, pending a full disciplinary hearing. You are required to cease all therapeutic activities, transfer your client files to appropriate providers, and refrain from representing yourself as a licensed therapist. Jenna stared at the envelope like it contained a bomb. You can't do this. I have clients who depend on me. I have a business to run. This is my career, my life's work. Your clients will be transferred to other qualified providers, the third official said. We're here to secure your files and ensure proper continuity of care for anyone who was receiving legitimate therapeutic services. Legitimate services? Jenna's voice was rising. All of my services were legitimate. I'm a licensed professional with 15 years of experience. I've helped hundreds of people save their marriages and relationships, while simultaneously destroying others through exploitation and fraud, I said quietly. Jenna turned to face me fully, and for the first time since I'd known her, I saw her without any pretense or professional mask. She looked desperate, angry, and completely defeated. How could you do this to me? She demanded. I'm your wife. We took vows. We promised to support each other through difficult times. You violated those vows when you started sleeping with your clients, I replied. You destroyed our marriage while billing insurance companies for the privilege. The therapeutic relationship is complex, she said, turning back to the investigators. Sometimes boundaries become blurred in the service of healing. That doesn't mean... Dr. Ardell, Patricia Williams interrupted. You billed insurance companies for couples therapy sessions after the wives had stopped attending. You charged for individual therapy while engaging in contact with clients. You systematically manipulated vulnerable individuals for your own gratification. These aren't blurred boundaries. They're serious crimes. The word crimes hit Jenna like a physical blow. She sat down heavily in her desk chair and stared at the suspension notice. What happens now? She asked quietly. You have 30 days to request a formal hearing if you wish to contest the suspension, Patricia Williams explained. However, based on the evidence we've gathered, I would strongly recommend that you consult with an attorney about potential criminal charges for insurance fraud and exploitation. Criminal charges? Jenna's voice was barely a whisper. Insurance fraud is a felony, the second investigator said. You billed insurance companies for services you didn't provide over a period of more than 2 years. The total amount of fraudulent billing appears to exceed $50,000. I watched my wife realize that she wasn't just losing her license, she might be going to prison. The client files need to be secured immediately, the third official said. We'll need access to your filing cabinets, computer records, and any other materials related to client care. Jenna looked around her office like she was seeing it for the last time. The diplomas on the wall, the comfortable chairs where she'd conducted legitimate therapy sessions, the desk where she'd written treatment plans and session notes, all of it was about to be taken away. Can I have a few minutes to collect my personal belongings? She asked. Of course, Patricia Williams said. But all client materials and business records remain here. I watched Jenna move around her office, gathering personal items with mechanical precision. A coffee mug, a small plant, a framed photo of us from our wedding that I was surprised she still kept on her desk. David, she said without looking at me, I know you're angry, but this will destroy everything. My career, our financial security, our future together. Is this really what you want? I want justice for the people you exploited, I said. I want consequences for the lies you told and the trust you violated. I want you to face the reality of what you've done." She turned to face me one last time. "I loved you. I still love you. This doesn't have to end our marriage." "You ended our marriage when you decided that exploiting vulnerable clients was more important than honoring your vows," I replied. "This is just making it official." Patricia Williams cleared her throat. "Dr. Ardell, we need to complete the file transfer process. Your personal items can be collected later, but we need to secure the premises now." Jenna picked up her purse and the few personal items she'd gathered. As she walked toward the door, she paused next to me. "I hope you're satisfied," she said quietly. "I hope destroying my life makes you feel better about whatever problems you think existed in our marriage." "Our marriage didn't have problems," I replied. "Our marriage had lies, and now it has consequences." She left without another word, and I watched through the window as she got into her car and drove away from the office she'd never be allowed to enter again. Patricia Williams approached me as the other investigators began cataloging client files. "Mr. Mitchell, the criminal investigation will begin next week. You may be called to testify if charges are filed." "I'll be ready," I said. "How are you feeling about all this?" she asked. I looked around the office that had been the center of my wife's professional life and the scene of her crimes against vulnerable people seeking help. "I feel like justice is finally being served," I said. That afternoon, I drove home to find Jenna sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop, frantically making phone calls to lawyers and professional consultants. She looked up when I walked in, and I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before: genuine fear. "David, we need to talk," she said. "This has gone too far. Maybe we can work something out with the licensing board, some kind of settlement or agreement." "There's nothing to work out," I replied. "You committed crimes, you exploited vulnerable people, you violated your professional ethics and your marriage vows. The consequences are exactly what you deserve." "But what about us?" she asked. "What about our marriage, our life together?" I looked at the woman I'd been married to for 15 years, the woman who'd systematically betrayed everything our relationship was supposed to represent while building a career on helping other people with their relationships. "There is no us anymore," I said. "There's just you facing the consequences of your choices." That evening, I moved my belongings to the guest bedroom and began the process of separating our financial accounts. Our marriage was over in every way that mattered, and soon it would be over legally as well. But first, I wanted to see one more thing. I wanted to watch Jenna's Google reviews continue to multiply as more people learned about what she'd done and added their own stories of suspicious behavior and professional misconduct. By the end of the week, her practice had 43 one-star reviews and an overall rating that had dropped to 0.8 stars. People were sharing screenshots of the reviews on social media, and local news outlets were starting to pick up the story. Dr. Jenna Ardell, once respected marriage counselor, was becoming a cautionary tale about professional ethics and the exploitation of vulnerable clients. And I was going to make sure everyone knew exactly what kind of therapy she'd really been providing. 3 weeks after Jenna's license suspension, the local newspaper ran a front-page story with the headline, "Marriage Counselor Faces Criminal Charges for Client Exploitation." The article included details from the licensing board investigation, quotes from the 3 victims who'd agreed to speak publicly, and a photograph of Jenna's now shuttered office with its "For Lease" sign prominently displayed. I read the article over coffee that morning while Jenna packed boxes in the living room. She'd finally accepted that our marriage was over and was moving back to her parents' house across town. The woman who'd built a career counseling couples through relationship crises couldn't save her own marriage from the consequences of her professional misconduct. "Are you happy now?" she asked, carrying another box toward the front door. "You've destroyed my career, ended our marriage, and turned me into a public embarrassment. Was it worth it?" I folded the newspaper and looked at her directly. Ask Reed Thompson if it was worth it. Ask Michael Chen. Ask Thomas Bradley. Ask all the clients whose trust you violated and whose vulnerabilities you exploited for your own gratification. I helped those men, she said defensively. They were struggling with relationship issues, and I provided them with support and understanding they couldn't get anywhere else. You provided them with exploitation disguised as therapy, I replied. You used your professional training to manipulate emotionally vulnerable people into relationships while billing their insurance companies for legitimate treatment. She set down the box and faced me with the same expression she'd probably used with clients when she was breaking down their psychological defenses. David, I know you're hurt and angry, but you're oversimplifying a complex situation. The therapeutic relationship isn't black and white. Sometimes healing requires unconventional approaches. Unconventional approaches, I repeated. Is that what you call insurance fraud and exploitation? I call it providing comprehensive care to people who needed more than traditional therapy could offer, she said. Those men were broken, damaged by failed relationships and emotional trauma. I helped them rebuild their confidence and learn to trust again. The casual way she continued to justify her crimes, even after losing her license and facing criminal charges, was almost impressive in its complete lack of self-awareness. You helped them by destroying their existing relationships and making them emotionally dependent on you, I said. You isolated them from their support systems and convinced them that contact with their therapist was therapeutic intervention. You wouldn't understand, she said, picking up the box again. You're not a trained mental health professional. You don't understand the complexities of therapeutic relationships and the sometimes blurred boundaries that exist in healing work. I stood up and walked over to where she was standing. I understand that you're a criminal who exploited vulnerable people for personal gratification while committing insurance fraud. I understand that you violated your professional ethics, your marriage vows, and the basic human decency that should govern how we treat people who come to us for help. She stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in her expression. The professional mask finally slipped completely, revealing the person underneath, someone who was angry, desperate, and absolutely unrepentant about what she'd done. You self-righteous bastard, she said quietly. You sit there in judgment of me like you're some kind of moral authority, but what you did was worse than anything I ever did. You spied on me, recorded my private conversations, violated my privacy, and systematically destroyed my life out of petty jealousy. I documented criminal activity and reported it to the appropriate authorities, I replied calmly. Everything I did was legal and ethical. Everything you did was illegal and exploitative. Legal doesn't mean right, she snapped. You could have talked to me, confronted me directly, suggested marriage counseling. Instead, you chose to destroy me professionally and personally without even giving me a chance to explain or make amends. Explain what? How you systematically exploited vulnerable clients while lying to your husband? Make amends for 2 years of fraud and misconduct? There's nothing to explain and no way to make amends for what you did. She picked up the box and headed toward the door, then stopped and turned back to face me one more time. I hope you're prepared for what comes next, she said. The criminal trial, the media attention, the gossip and speculation. Everyone in town is going to know the intimate details of our marriage and my practice. You'll be just as much a public spectacle as I am. I'm prepared for people to know the truth about what you did, I said. I'm prepared to testify about the evidence I gathered and the crimes I witnessed. I'm prepared to see justice done. She left without another word, and I watched through the window as she loaded the last of her belongings into her car and drove away from the house we'd shared for 15 years. That afternoon, I received a call from the district attorney's office. They were moving forward with criminal charges against Jenna for insurance fraud, and they wanted to schedule an interview to discuss my testimony. The case is very strong, the prosecutor explained. We have documentary evidence of fraudulent billing, witness testimony from the victims, and your detailed records of her criminal activity. She'll likely be offered a plea bargain, but if she refuses, we'll take it to trial. What kind of sentence are we looking at? I asked. Insurance fraud at this level is a felony that carries a potential sentence of 2 to 5 years in prison, plus restitution to the insurance companies and fines. The licensing board violations are separate civil matters, but they support the criminal charges. 2 weeks later, Jenna was formally indicted on 12 counts of insurance fraud and 3 counts of professional misconduct. The local media covered the story extensively, and her case became a cautionary tale about professional ethics and the exploitation of vulnerable clients. I testified at the preliminary hearing, describing how I'd discovered her criminal activity and documented the evidence that led to her license suspension. The courtroom was packed with reporters, former clients, and curious members of the public who wanted to see the once respected therapist face the consequences of her actions. Jenna's attorney tried to portray her as a dedicated professional whose unconventional methods had been misunderstood and misrepresented by a vindictive husband and confused clients. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the testimony from her victims was compelling and detailed. Reed Thompson described how she'd systematically destroyed his marriage while convincing him that contact was therapeutic intervention. Michael Chen explained how she'd coached him to lie to his wife about their sessions and build insurance companies for couples therapy after his wife had stopped attending. Thomas Bradley testified about how she'd exploited his inexperience and social anxiety to manipulate him into a relationship disguised as surrogate therapy. The preliminary hearing lasted 3 days, and at the end, the judge ruled that there was sufficient evidence to proceed with a full criminal trial. But Jenna's attorney had apparently advised her that fighting the charges would likely result in a longer prison sentence. 2 days before the trial was scheduled to begin, she accepted a plea bargain. She pled guilty to 8 counts of insurance fraud and agreed to make full restitution to the insurance companies she'd defrauded. In exchange for her guilty plea, she received a sentence of 18 months in prison, 3 years of probation, and a permanent ban from working in any healthcare-related field. I was present in the courtroom when she was sentenced, sitting in the back row and watching as the judge explained the terms of her punishment. She stood at the defendant's table in a conservative business suit, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. "Dr. Ardell," the judge said, "you violated the trust of vulnerable individuals who came to you seeking legitimate therapeutic help. You exploited their emotional vulnerabilities for your own gratification while defrauding insurance companies and violating your professional ethics. Your actions represent a serious breach of the public trust and warrant significant consequences." Jenna nodded and mumbled something that might have been an apology, but I couldn't hear it clearly from where I was sitting. The sentence of this court is 18 months in the state correctional facility, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. You will make full restitution to the defrauded insurance companies in the amount of $63,400. You are permanently prohibited from obtaining any license to practice therapy or counseling in this state. After the sentencing, I walked out of the courthouse and drove to the downtown area where Jenna's office had been located. The Victorian building had been renovated, and a new business had moved into the space where she'd once conducted her practice. A small sign in the window advertised Henderson Accounting Services, professional, ethical, reliable. I stood on the sidewalk for a few minutes, looking up at the second-floor windows where my wife had systematically exploited vulnerable people while building a reputation as a skilled marriage counselor. The irony of her career choice had never been lost on me. She'd made her living helping other people save their relationships while destroying her own through criminal misconduct. 6 months later, I received a letter from Reed Thompson thanking me for having the courage to report Jenna's crimes and file the complaint that led to her license suspension. He'd entered therapy with a legitimate counselor and was working on rebuilding his relationship with his ex-wife, who was willing to consider reconciliation now that they understood how they'd been manipulated. Michael Chen sent a similar letter, explaining that he'd joined a support group for victims of professional exploitation and was learning to process the trauma of being manipulated by someone he'd trusted to help him. His divorce had been finalized, but he was optimistic about his ability to form healthy relationships in the future. Thomas Bradley's letter was the most moving. He described how Jenna's exploitation had damaged his ability to trust mental health professionals and form intimate relationships with women. But he was working with a legitimate therapist who specialized in treating victims of professional misconduct, and he was slowly learning to distinguish between therapeutic support and exploitation. All three men had received financial settlements from Jenna's malpractice insurance company and were using the money to pay for legitimate therapy with ethical professionals. I kept their letters in a file folder along with copies of all the evidence I'd gathered, the licensing board investigation reports, and newspaper clippings about Jenna's criminal trial. It was a complete record of how a respected marriage counselor had destroyed her career, her marriage, and the lives of vulnerable clients through systematic exploitation and fraud. Sometimes I took out the folder and reviewed the timeline of events that had led from my discovery of that burner phone to Jenna's imprisonment and professional disgrace. It had taken 8 months from beginning to end, 8 months of careful documentation, strategic reporting, and patient waiting for the justice system to work. But it had worked. The licensing board had investigated thoroughly and imposed appropriate discipline. The criminal justice system had prosecuted the fraud and imposed meaningful consequences. The insurance companies had been made whole through restitution payments. Most importantly, Jenna's victims had been validated and supported through the process of holding their exploiter accountable for her crimes. I never visited Jenna in prison, and I didn't attend her release hearing. By the time she completed her sentence, I had filed for divorce, sold our house, and moved to a different city where I could start over without the constant reminders of our failed marriage and her professional disgrace. But I kept the folder, and sometimes I shared the story with people who asked about my divorce or wondered why I was so skeptical of mental health professionals who seemed too interested in crossing boundaries or blurring ethical lines. Trust is the foundation of any therapeutic relationship, I would tell them. When that trust is violated, the damage goes far beyond the immediate victims. It undermines confidence in legitimate professionals and makes it harder for people who genuinely need help to seek treatment. The story of Dr. Jenna Ardell became a case study in professional ethics courses and a cautionary tale about the importance of maintaining appropriate boundaries in therapeutic relationships. Her crimes were documented in academic journals and professional training materials as an example of how trusted professionals can exploit vulnerable clients when oversight and accountability systems fail. But for me, it was simpler than that. It was the story of how I discovered that my wife was a criminal, documented her crimes, reported them to the appropriate authorities, and watched as justice was served. The marriage counselor who built her reputation helping other people save their relationships had destroyed her own through systematic exploitation and fraud. The licensing board had investigated, the courts had prosecuted, and the victims had been vindicated. Justice had been served, and that was enough.